Continuing on, thank you, Jesus. We'll just get right to it. The recovery team maintained a corporate silence. No. Okay, son. Or let's get you home. Their iciness implied that I was being reprimanded more than rescued. So I remained silent as well. That heavy breathing air escort would get nothing else from me until I figured out just what was transpiring up there. That was the last paragraph that I read to start the new. So I didn't lose where I was. As we descended, one of the squad members placed a mask over my mouth and nose, and I gasped in several greedy breaths, the oxygen finding its way through my body. The aberration in G's appeared to be over with nothing still airborne in sight. By the time we landed in the Flagstone's front yard, I had regained my faculties. I knew nothing of the Flagstone family, except there was an older son off at college, and they had once tried to rename the nearby waterway of Chuck Slough to something more refined like Charles Creek. Absurd, I had decided at that time, picturing the many afternoons I spent getting filthy there. My attempt to leave the scene, offering some shaken but casual thank yous, was stymied. Why aren't you letting me go home? I asked the offers fervidly. They claimed it was standard procedure to take me downtown for some questions. Nothing about that madness was standard, and they couldn't pretend otherwise. Mrs. Flagstone opened her front door to greet the agents, and I could see her scan for a point of interest. She found none in the chaotic mix of people running here and there. Her enormous brick and block home was bathed in flashing light, like an eyewitness to some strange and terrible crime. With a blanket draped over my trembling shoulders, I sat on the back of an ambulance while several paramedics checked my vitals and asked some forgettable health and state of mind questions. My own rambling questions about what was going on fell on deaf ears. No one offered an opinion on the matter, let alone an answer. Looking up at the now peaceful sky, I wandered off in thought, trying to reconcile the bizarre incident with the sobering view around me. Despite the prevalence of freak happenings, that yanking of my metaphorical hair went far beyond anything I'd heard about so far. Artificial induction of a gravity crisis? Suggested my father's voice from somewhere in the ether. Dad had suspected that someone was lessening the planet's pull, or was at least trying to experiment with how. But why here? And why so severe? I thought. Nothing I'd learned so far about the Earth's dropping G's could explain why one street might suffer such an attack. After all, as far as we could tell, the four-letter agency had backed off on its surveillance of our family some time ago. Could someone have been onto us anyway, sending a coincidental glitch right toward our house? And if the so-called alien saviors had caused the strange happening, why had they let me survive? I hoped the local authorities would allow me to make the news. If they didn't, Jay would never believe it. It's been a decade in dog years since that fantastic event unfolded. A decade in dog years. That would be 70, right? The day I floated away still stands out as the most bizarre and vivid, despite many close competitors. The choice of where to begin this narrative was obvious, but the time ahead feels short. I may not have enough of it left to explain how I became such a large fly in the universal ointment. The destruction that's always meant to have me inches closer, I've made my last daring escape. Exhausting my final days, relaying some grand campaign would be satisfying, but the truth stands in the way, so I will go ahead with it as it happened, translating my own scribbles, notes, quotes, sketches, and collected letters. One more tale for the drowning sea, so that so many have filled before me. The air in this room has turned from a hint of smoke into something more threatening, and my pen moves faster. That was the end of chapter 1 of part 1, Floating Away. This is the beginning of chapter 2 of part 1, Floating Away. It starts with a quote from Piper Corcoran. Can Things Get Any Stranger? Volume 1. While rumors about our gravity sporadically plummeting are becoming more widespread, public coverage of the growing phenomenon remains vague at best. The big three channels have all but ceased broadcasting the tragic accidents that are occurring as a result, and with the internet still down, it's problematic for the average citizen to determine just how many of our G's have already been lost. Something sinister seems to be soft pedaling Earth's most recent and most monumental catastrophe. This is the story of a boy's journey from nothingness to somethingness and back to nothingness again, finally embracing all that broke him along the way. Like an intensive butcher carving meat until he reaches bone, the past, or destroyer as I come to call it, stripped away all the unnecessary. Was it fate's way of keeping this rich man smaller than the eye of a needle? If so, I'll be eternally grateful. I'd like to say it was a simple journey, but the odds were too often defied to say so. More than that, the odds were slapped about like a stunned child. That I still have breath is a testament to the miracles that have safeguarded me so far. Well, I can relate to that statement. If my archaic writing style curdles your ears, please forgive me. Like most, I suffer from the influence of golden speech with every stroke. You, my reader, may be battling this tendency as well. It's been difficult to resist the impulse to artificially elevate oneself. When the gods, little g, again decided to mingle with man, we puffed ourselves out any way we could. Some called the attempted sophistication florid tongue. But whatever title you give this convoluted grammar, it sent us backward, just where they wanted it all to go. While the urge to write this tale has been undeniable, its intent is unknown. Will any flesh be left alive to read it? If you've happened upon these words and they have not been consumed by fire, ask for what purpose. Then move toward that purpose straight away. Your time is even shorter than mine. Let's waste no more of it. I had floated away and returned, or so it seemed. Baffled, I strained to decipher the cause, or its events had actually happened as my panicked memory recalled them. Inside a traditional cruiser, I sat in a startled silence for a short drive to downtown Sandpoint. I guess they figured I'd had enough of flying for the night and avoided sending me down in one of the hover types. When we arrived at Central Station, the parking lot was crawling with agents carrying out some kind of drill. If I wasn't already shaken to the core, this sudden rush of activity finished the job. A large transport screeched to a stop, and the rear of the hauler groaned and tilted skyward. Its steel panels slid open to reveal a massive civil defense exosuit. A big toy for a small town. Maybe, but places like Sandpoint, in what used to be known as Idaho, had gotten a lot bigger. Nestled within mountains and endless waterways, the area had dodged much of the destruction that had trampled the world. When the calamities unleashed, our evergreen hills and crystal streams drew a much higher population as masses of people fled California, the Southwest, and other water-starved or war-torn areas for greener, wetter, more peaceful pastures. Our town was far from a bustling metropolis, but then again, hardly any place was anymore. As an officer used my elbow to guide me towards the station's front entry, a loud beeping, accompanied by whirling lights of red and yellow, caught my attention. The squad shouted to each other as the single pilot, armor looked ready to step its massive alloy foot out onto the pavement. Lumbering and impractical, yes, but made simply because we could. However, if the exercise was a rapid deployment drill, it was hardly a success. The men scrambled to figure out why the giant hulk remained motionless inside its truck-based cocoon. At an absurd rate, our society was rebuilding from the ashes, but in those days it felt like our phoenix was floundering rather than soaring. Moods didn't improve much inside the station when I refused to take a blood test. It was family policy to treat the authorities and what they might do with one's DNA with a healthy dose of suspicion. So the situation grew into a standoff. Most blood specimen requests were mandatory, but since I was not being accused of anything, they weren't justified to push it. Still shaking a little, I kept expecting them to show some concern. The Cooperative Force of Peace and Order, or CFPO, was presented by the media as an improved and enlightened body of justice. In reality, however, it seemed that there was a lot of force behind peace and order. After ushering me into the most featureless room I'd ever seen, several plainclothes officers left me sitting there alone for an indeterminable length of time. If these evil servants intended to agitate me, they were succeeding. From what I could see on my way in, I was the only person in Central who had been caught up in the phenomenon, confirming that my experience was isolated. The lone table and chair I occupied were nearly the same shade of beige as the walls, floors, and ceiling. Like many structures, Central Station was newly built and fit the current style of lacking style. The smell of new paint was refreshing at first, but it turned quickly nauseating. My knee pounded against the underside of the table with increasing force. It was downright excruciating to be stuck without my earphone, unable to call the team and relay the surreal scenario of being sucked up into the clouds. My iBud was at home on the kitchen counter along with an assortment of sandwich-making ingredients. No doubt Mom had walked in the door by now, aghast of the mess left on her immaculate countertops, wondering why the culprit was not around to clean it up. One of the agents had promised 20 minutes before that I could make a call, but no one had provided the means. I considered some inappropriate gestures I might offer those behind the large rectangular mirror on the wall, actions that might alleviate the boredom when an agent entered. "Can I call my mom now?" I asked before he was fully in the room. The agent paused and grimaced at the sight of me. A very large man in a black uniform with a tie of the same color walked in and leaned against the wall opposite the mirror. His appearance was without wrinkle or defect, as if he had just stepped off the factory floor where they made stereotypical square-jawed police characters. The sudden mixture of too much cologne and paint fumes made me ache for air. "She's on her way," the flawless agent replied, opening a red folder to grumble through its contents. He continued, not bothering to look up. "So you're Evan Fillmore's son. My name is Chamberlain Maddox. I wasn't here when your father went missing." He kept scanning in May of this year. I transferred in shortly after. His left eyebrow rose as he stared at the file and continued grumbling. "Your mother may have had a hand in replacing my predecessor." That was likely true. The Chamberlain went on. "Are you aware of any new developments in his case?" "Aren't you the one with the update?" I sniped, eager to see where provocation might lead. Chamberlain Maddox looked up at me with an expression that said he was already fed up with Central's new visitor. Like every other adult, he did not appreciate my arrogant approach. I can relate to that one. I thought he might bite and get right to straightening me out, but instead he sighed and went back to looking through his notes. "Incredible," he dangled with nothing more. I didn't bite either. Finally, the dramatic pause ended. "Filthy rich, filthy, filthy, filthy. It says here your family hardly felt any economic hardship during the crunch. I've never seen that notation before." He shook his head and feigned some more reading until, "Tell me, what was it like to have so much when so many had so little?" The tapping of a manicured finger against his pursed lips suggested he'd just said something profound. The kinder, gentler Garrett would have to wait. This guy was pushing all the right buttons. "It was great, actually. I used to throw rocks at all the poor kids when they came up to beg." My hands praised the ceiling before finding the back of my head, showing how absurd I thought the exchange had become. "If that folder of yours is any good, it'll have my parents' foundation in there. My family gave away a ton, and they always wished it had been more. Can I see your account statements and find out what you were?" Feeling an urgent heat flush my face, I cut myself off. Not only were account statements non-existent during the era in question, I was giving Maddox just the reaction he wanted. I shifted gears to get us back on the topic that should have been dominant. When I asked if we knew why the G's had given out completely, suggesting we were all on the same team, the Chamberlain ignored my sudden rationality. He insisted he'd get to all that in a moment and kept to his script. I mean, it's no wonder your family ran into trouble. Those posh houses scream the old regime of entitlement and comfort. I'm surprised any of you survived. It says here that your mother actually purchased a custom 6-person transport with only 2 citizens in your home. The resources that must have wasted. Why own anything anymore? Isn't free good enough? The thick-jawed Chamberlain locked his eyes on me, asserting his will to crumble mine. When it didn't, he softened, intrigued over my self-control. Then, suddenly seized by boredom, the folder closed with finality. The Chamberlain let out a long, exaggerated sigh. We made some calls, and there's a difference of opinion. One department wants me to take that blood sample of yours, with or without your permission, and run some tests. I ruled against it. There's nothing extraordinary about you. They needn't waste their time. Chamberlain Maddox paused on his way toward the door. By the way, he added, his tone dripping with disdain, how did you like being dangled up there? Helpless for the world to see. A grinchy smile curled the corners of his mouth, while mine fell open, stupefied by the insinuation. Had this man just suggested he was party to the incident, or even the source? I fumbled to formulate a clarifying question, but he was already out the door.